Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the history of the NFL. Now, before we get into the history of the NFL, we need to learn about the game of football. The game of football pretty much is all about scoring, and that happens primarily whenever team's ball carrier, whoever has the ball, enters the end zone. It could be the defense, it could be the offense. But if the ball carrier loses possession of the ball, like this person right here, Deshaun Jackson, then there is no touchdown. The NFL was formed by multiple businessmen in the year 1920, which means it is in its 101st season of play. And there are only two teams that started the league that are still competing, and that are the New York Giants and the Arizona Cardinals, who were originally based in St. Louis. And the early years of the NFL, college football was mainly prominent. If you wanted to watch football, you weren't going to watch the NFL. You were going to watch college games. And it wasn't until players like Jim Thorpe and Red Grange came along, and they were their generation's Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes. They were household names in the U.S. Not really much happened in the 30s. The big thing of the 30s is the NFL implemented the draft. It was unanimously voted that each year that they would have a selection meeting where instead of just a mad scramble for athletes, they would have a draft, and the team with the worst record would have the number one overall pick. And the number one overall pick of the first draft pick ever, was Heisman Trophy winner Jay Berwanger, who turned down a job in the NFL. Yes, he turned down an NFL contract. Pack rubber. Let that sink in. He packed rubber instead of playing in the NFL. And the NFL was affected a lot by World War II because players were enlisted to go fight in the army. And some owners actually were enlisted to go fight in Europe on the front lines for the good old US of A. And as a Bears reporter once said, and I quote, "You are seeing the mighty Bears for the last time today. 10 of them are leaving to go to the nation's armed forces." In the 50s, there wasn't really too much to note, but it was the time for players like Jim Brown, Chuck Bednarik, and Norman Van Brocklin to shine, because that was pretty much the first time that they made helmets mandatory to wear, and padding there. Before then, they were just going at it with no pads, no helmets, just full on body contact, bones breaking, all of that. But in the year 1960, there was a big, huge major change, in that the AFL was formed by Al Davis. And that was the first time that the NFL actually had legitimate competition for TV ratings and TV deals. Another thing that happened in that year, the Dallas Cowboys were formed, but we don't really. They're not that important until later on. One of the biggest changes in modern sports history was made in 1966, whenever the AFL and the NFL agreed to have their teams meet in what was originally called the World Series of Football, but we would know it later on as the Super Bowl. And the Super Bowl name actually came about because Chiefs owner Lamar Hunt saw his kids playing with the Super Ball toy, and he just took it the name. And speaking of the Chiefs, they actually played in the first Super Bowl, where they faced the Green Bay Packers, led by legendary coach Vince Lombardi. And the NFL teams dominated the AFL teams until the one man, Joe Cool, not Snoopy, but Joe Cool, Joe Namath, said in an interview by Poolside, he said, "I guarantee the Jets are going to win on Sunday. I guarantee it." And they did. He guaranteed it. He was not wrong. They were the first AFC or AFL team to win the Super Bowl. In 1970, the AFL and the NFL actually decided to merge, and there's a famous picture to commemorate this at the NFL League Commissioner Pete Rozelle holding a football with the NFL letters and the AFL written on both of them and holding them together, representing the unity of the two leagues. And in the 70s, it was the time for the Pittsburgh Steelers dynasty. This was really the first time for dynasties to be implemented into the modern football. And the Pittsburgh Steelers, they had Terry Bradshaw as quarterback. And they had one of the best cornerbacks ever, which actually implemented a rule change. It's called the Mel Blount rule because he was so good at jamming receivers, like he would just get up all in their face, and they made it illegal for a quarterback to make for a defender to make contact with the receiver 5 yards off of the line of scrimmage. So Saints fans, that's why you didn't win the Super Bowl in 2016. Now, the 80s were the time to be a football fan, really. You had Jerry Rice catching passes from Joe Montana. You had prime time Deion Sanders strutting down the field with a pick six. You had Bo Jackson rushing over everybody, even in Tecmo Bowl, which was really the first NFL video game, but we'll get into that a little bit later. And you had legendary coach R.I.P. John Madden, coach who had just resigned and now is a commentator. And speaking of John Madden, the first iteration of John Madden Football was released in 1988. To this day, I believe it is the highest selling sports franchise besides Wii Sports in history. I mean, it's kind of just. And you had Steve Young coming in at the tail end of the 90s. It was the best time to be a football fan. The 49ers were that decade's dynasty, winning some Super Bowls. And next up is the 90s. The 90s had way more star power. You had Randy Moss, Troy Aikman at quarterback, Randall Cunningham, Peyton Manning came in 98. The 90s is probably one of the best decades of the NFL. And with that, actually the Dallas Cowboys were the dynasty of the 90s, led by aforementioned Troy Aikman. And there was a whole bunch of defenders that you had to look out for to be in that backfield. You had Reggie White in the 90s. There was Reggie White, Lawrence Taylor, aforementioned Prime Time, Deion Sanders, not to mention Bruce Smith. And speaking of Bruce Smith, he was on the Bills. The Bills lost 4 straight Super Bowls in a row, which is probably never going to be broken. I don't see any team doing that. Now, in the 2000s, you had quarterbacks like Kurt Warner. You had running backs like LT, LaDainian Tomlinson. You had Phillip Rivers, Drew Brees. Tom Brady was drafted. There was a whole bunch of players. And speaking of Tom Brady, he implemented a rule called the Tuck Rule, which actually helped them win a game and kickstart the Patriots dynasty. And that's where we are today. Tom Brady is now on the Buccaneers, and yeah, let's see who wins this year's Super Bowl. Let's see who states their name in history, and maybe it might